Let's begin by looking at contemporary researcher Tudor Parfet. He discovered the following pattern when he began researching first-hand accounts of Europeans in West Africa. He writes, ethnographers, missionaries, colonial civil servants, and travelers, time and time again, maintain that the African tribes, including the Osa, the Maasai, the Yoruba, the Shona, the Igbo, the Zulus, the Hottentots, the Tutsi, the Ashanti, and many more, practiced Jewish customs, spoke partially Jewish languages, and were of Jewish biological origin. Now, unknowingly, Parfet described all E1B1A tribes. I repeat, he described all E1B1A tribes, which includes the African Americans, the so-called African Americans. So in other words, ethnographers, missionaries, colonial civil servants, and travelers, time and time again, maintained that the forefathers of the African Americans were of Jewish biological origin. Dr. Yehoshua ben Ephraim also identifies correlation between E1B1A and its Judean roots. I strongly recommend checking out his Facebook page on E1B1A. Next, let's look at a map of Africa shown in the back of a book authored by Duke University professor Alan Godbey. Alan Godbey's book shows the location of some of the Jews in West Africa. Tudor Parfet's research explains that writers of antiquity, or writers during the time of slavery, insisted that Jews lived on the west coast of Africa. And you may wonder, why would Jews live on the west coast of Africa? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to first go back in time. Back to the time of Moses. Back to a time when a rock cleaved in two. We must go back to a time when Moses and the children of Israel camped at the base of Mount Sinai, at the base of a burning mountain, and entered into the covenant with the Most High Yahweh. The Most High Yahweh set forth before them life and death, blessings and curses. In other words, the Most High Yahweh gave Israel a choice. If Israel chose to obey Yahweh's laws, statutes, and commandments, Yahweh promised to place them above all the people of the earth. He would make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. However, if Israel chose not to obey Yahweh's laws, statutes, and commandments, He promised the curses. He said the curses would overtake and pursue Israel, and that they would be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. The Bible tells us that these curses would be assigned to identify the children of Israel around the world, that they would pursue Israel wherever they were scattered. And even though they were placed under the curse, all was not lost, because the most merciful Yahweh provided a way back into Yahweh's blessing. And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations, whither the Elohim thy Yahweh has driven thee, and shalt return unto the Elohim thy Yahweh, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that then the Elohim thy Yahweh will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations, whether the Elohim thy Yahweh has scattered thee. If any of thine be driven unto the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Elohim thy Yahweh gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Elohim thy Yahweh will bring thee unto the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it. And he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. So, Yahweh promises to return and gather Israel. This is prophesied to take place on the great and terrible day of the Lord. For example, in the 50th chapter of Psalms, it reads, Our Yahweh shall come, and shall not keep silent. A fire shall devour before him. It shall be very tempestuous round about him. He shall call to the heavens from above, and to the earth, that he may judge his people. Gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice. And the heavens shall declare his righteousness, for Yahweh is judge himself. Selah. Matthew 24 reads, And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Mark chapter 13 reads, In those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then shall he send his angels, and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the utmost part of the earth to the utmost part of heaven. Now, the identification of the elect can be found in the 45th chapter of Isaiah, and it reads, And I will give thee the treasures of darkness, and the hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Elohim, which call thee by thy name, am the Elohim of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect. I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. Likewise, the 148th chapter of Psalms defines the saints, and it reads, He also exalteth the horn of his people, the praise of all his saints, even of the children of Israel, a people near unto him. Praise ye the Elohim. In summary, Christ, and only Christ, will return and gather the scattered children of Israel. He will send his angels to the four corners of the earth and gather the children of Israel. This will occur on what's referred to as the great and terrible day of the Lord. While living in the land of their captivity, Israel wrote songs telling of the impending rescue from their captors. So, let's review. Israel entered into a covenant with Yahweh. However, Israel failed to uphold their side of the agreement. Therefore, Israel was placed under the curse. And part of the curse was that Israel would be scattered to all the nations on the earth, and also that their children would be given to another people. I recommend reading the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy in its entirety. Okay, now that we know Israel was scattered among the nations, let's look at the different ways in which Israel was scattered or dispersed. So the first dispersion was the Assyrian dispersion. This dispersion involved the scattering of the northern tribes. The next dispersion is the African dispersion. Details of this dispersion can be found within the scriptures to the right. The next dispersion is the Roman dispersion. Details of this dispersion were foretold by Christ in the 21st chapter of Luke. And finally, the last dispersion, arguably the worst dispersion of them all. Why? Well, because it lasted the longest and caused the most deaths, and it has the greatest impact on so-called African Americans today. The Inquisition dispersion. To understand why this dispersion impacts so-called African Americans most of all, we need to go back to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. In a book titled An Historical Survey of the Island of St. Domingo, it reads, "A curious circumstance was, however, omitted. When the Portuguese first began the traffic in Negroes, application was made to the Pope to sanctify the trade by a bull, which His Holiness issued accordingly. In consequence of this permission and authority, a very considerable slave market was established in Lisbon, which is Portugal, insomuch that above the year 1539, from 10 to 12,000 Negroes were sold there annually." You may wonder, why would a pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, authorize the Negro slave trade during the time of the Inquisition? Well, in order to answer that question, let's take a look at a few references, a few first-hand accounts. The following quote comes from a book authored by John Ogilby of London, who in 1674 was appointed His Majesty's cosmographer and geographic printer. Now, the following quote comes from page 574, and the name of the book is on your screen. And the quote reads, "That John III, King of Portugal, sent a colony thither above 200 years before, whom though the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. For he sent new inhabitants who first settled Guinea, next Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be better used to the air, that the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom coming thither in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended." In other words, the present inhabitants of Guinea, Angola, and St. Thomas were descended from the Jews. Keep in mind that Guinea, Angola, and St. Thomas are on the west coast of Africa, and that the King of Portugal placed the Jews on the west coast of Africa in great numbers because they refused to embrace the Roman religion. Now you understand why the Pope authorized the Negro slave trade. Here's the quote in its entirety. Please press your pause button now to read it for yourself. In 1622, Cape Verdean Governor Don Francisco confirms the presence of Jews on the Guinea coast when he reports to the King of Portugal when he states, "The Guinea coastal rivers were full of Jews who were masters of the local regions and were quite independent of the crown." The following is a 1743 map of Guinea. Notice that Guinea is located or shown on the map in yellow, and that to the south of Guinea is Angola. Notice that both of these territories make up the west coast of Africa. And also note that the Jews of the west coast of Africa were known to the Europeans as Black Jews. Now on to our next quote. Now this next quote sheds additional light on the exportation of Jews to the west coast of Africa. And it reads, "Unfortunately, at the time of the expulsion, the plague was raging in Castile, and the fugitives brought with them the disease, propagating it wherever they went, and not unnaturally causing their advent to be viewed with loathing and horror. This circumstance induced King John to hasten their departure from Portugal, for which purpose ships were duly provided, according to the agreement, but such was the temper of the captains and the sailors that they subjected the Jews to the hardest possible conditions. They plundered them of their goods and valuables, even to their very clothes, and landed them naked and bare of everything on barren points of the African coast, leaving them to die of starvation. or to be sold into slavery to the Moors. Nor was this all. The king wrested from their parents all the children between the ages of 3 and 10 of those Jewish immigrants who from poverty or otherwise had omitted to pay the capitation tax on entering, or who were forced to remain in Portugal, and had them transported to the newly discovered islands of St. Thomas, which then swarmed with alligators and other beasts of prey, to be brought up as Christians. This next quote comes from the official chronicler of King John, Garcia de Resende, and it reads, "The official chronicler of King John, Garcia de Resende, reports on one of the methods to populate this island that also throws some light on the tragic form of Jewish participation in the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. The king had allowed Jewish refugees from Spain, from where they had been expelled in 1492, to remain in Portugal only in return for payment of an enormous ransom. In 1493, those who could not pay had their children taken away from them, baptized by force, and deported to St. Thomas in order to be raised as Christians and to help populate the island that the king had just leased to Alvaro." Skipping ahead. Nothing is known of their further fate, although later chroniclers attribute the thriving sugar production on the island to the talents of these deported children and their offspring. So far, we've learned that the King of Portugal sent the Jews to the west coast of Africa. We also learned that the children of the Jews were sent to the west coast of Africa under the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, under the authority of the Pope, with the intent that they would be raised as Christians and sold into slavery. These West African Portuguese communities were described as Black Portuguese communities in Guinea and in the islands. So far, we focused mainly on Portugal's involvement in the slave trade. However, now let's turn our attention to Spain. Now, the following quote focuses on the west coast of Africa. Now, feel free to press the pause button to read this quote in its entirety. However, I'm going to jump down to the bottom, and it reads as this: "Moreover, in Spain, they but seldom put their malefactors, their criminals, to death, as we do in France. They send them all to these desert countries to traffic there," referring to the west coast of Africa. In other words, Spain sent their criminals, or their Jews, that were convicted by the Inquisition to the west coast of Africa to be sold there as slaves. Now, let's take a closer look at the Inquisition. Libro Negro. That was one of the popular names of the Book of the Inquisition. Within this book contained the punishments for every supposed crime, as well as the methods for conducting the punishments. Now, let's take a look inside of the Libro Negro to see exactly where those who were convicted were sent. It reads, "She shall be exiled to the island of Principe, St. Thomas, or Angola." Number 3, shall be exiled to Angola or St. Thomas. Number 4, exiled to St. Thomas or Angola. Number 6, shall be exiled to St. Thomas, Angola, or Brazil. Those sent into exile were later sold into slavery, and the profit made from them was immense. For example, the following quote reads, by Angola accounts, that the profit of the Negro trade amounted yearly to 66 tons of gold. Here we note an interesting connection between the term Negro and the Inquisition. For example, Libro Negro, that was the term used for the Book of the Inquisition. Negro Legend, that was the term used for the denial of Inquisition persecutions. And lastly, Peste Negra, or Black Death. That was the term used to describe the plague associated with the Jews. Now, you may wonder, what is the significance about the term Negro and the Jews? Well, to find out, let's take a closer look. The term Negro, or the Spanish word for black, wasn't commonly used in England until the 19th century. Now, what that means is that prior to being called Negro, Negroes were called something else. In fact, the term Negro, or the term black, was associated with the Jews. The Jews are composed of 3 or 4 separate racial elements. The Asiatic Negroid strain shows itself occasionally in the curly hair, the long eye, and proportions of the skull. The Jewish hybrids with the Negro in Jamaica and Ghana reproduce most strikingly the Assyrian type.